Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to PTV World. I am Tayyaba and you're watching Views on News. A very significant climate change conference is taking place right now in Egypt, the COP-27. And of course, very important pledges are going to be taken as well by the end of the conference as well. The United Nations chief has termed it, the world is on a highway to the climate hell, which of course is a very remarkable stance and a very remarkable statement that has been posed by him as well. We know that the world is going towards the hell direction unless something is done regarding this. And that is why all the developing states are there to try and raise the voice for the global south. And that is why the Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, is also there to raise the voice for the global south for all the developing states as well. And very effectively, assertively, and impactfully raising the voice and taking a case against the world for Pakistan and all the developing states as well. He has a brilliant team with him as well. The Foreign Minister, Bilal Bhutto Zardari, the Climate Change Minister, Ms. Sherry Rahman, and so many others as well who are highlighting all these significant developments and regarding how the climate disaster has affected Pakistan. Around 200 bridges have been destroyed, 1,800 people have lost their lives, $33 billion worth of damage, and so much more. Let's take a look at this report that has been prepared by our team, and then we'll be right back.
Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Foreign Minister Bilal Bhutto Zardari has remained very assertive and dedicated in propagating and presenting the case of climate change and its adverse effects, which has impacted Pakistan adversely in the form of unprecedented and catastrophic floods recently. While accumulating successes in this climate justice realm, Prime Minister Mohammad Shehbaz Sharif participated in the significant Sharm El-Sheikh Climate Implementation Summit as a part of the 27th United Nations Climate Change Conference. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, while addressing the high-level roundtable at COP-27 on the scaling up action and support on losses and damages, the global shield against climate risks, underscored that the vulnerable developing countries such as Pakistan were already witnessing unprecedented devastating impacts of climate change, even though they have contributed very little to it. He underlined that the issue of loss and damage was one of the key priorities for Pakistan and welcomed its inclusion as an agenda item of COP-27. He highlighted that it was for the first time that the COP had agreed to formally discuss funding arrangements for loss and damage achieved through persistent push by the developing countries under Pakistan's chairmanship of Group of 77 and China. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said that Pakistan was fully committed to the objectives of Middle East Green Initiative and offered assistance to member countries in sharing technical expertise on forest restoration in dry lands. Addressing the Middle East Green Initiative Summit at the Conference of Parties platform, the Prime Minister termed Middle East Green Initiative one big step in the right direction to save the planet from the disasters of climate change.
You just watched a report on this issue as well on the COP27 that is going on currently in Egypt in Sharm El-Sheikh. Of course, the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has co-chaired the conference, the roundtable of the conference as well. Of course, that is on climate change and sustainability of the vulnerable communities, something very significant. And not just that, he's also partaken in many different roundtables and side conferences as well as a speaker. One of them, a very significant one, was of course the Middle East Green Initiative. There are a lot of governmental policies that he highlighted and how the objectives of the Middle East Green Initiative also coincide with the objectives of Pakistan as well, such as the National Forest Policy, Green Pakistan Program, and of course the Forestation Initiative as well. The fact that we're trying to triple the 3.3 billion target of the afforestation as well. Now, of course, let's go on to the introduction of our guests and we'll continue with this discussion as well. We have our guest in studio, Mr. Waqar Sherazi, who is an expert of disaster response, social development and research expert as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks indeed, Tayyaba.
We're also joined by Dr. Niaz Murtaza, who is a political analyst on Skype with us. Thank you for joining us. And we are, of course, going to be joined by Dr. Waqar Ahmed as well, who's a joint executive director of the SDPI later as well. And we will, of course, thank him for joining us as well. Of course, now let's go on to what the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has talked about in the COP27 earlier on, and that is the nature-based solution. What are the nature-based solutions, and how do you think they can help us in mitigating the climate adaptation?
Well, many thanks, Tayyaba, for having me here today. And as we all know that the climate change is a reality which is faced by all over the globe internationally. And from last 27 years, the International Conference of Parties from the forum of UNFCCC has been looking how to combat the negative interventions which has been causing negative change in climate, and to provide an environment which is suitable for habitants on the earth. The sustainable solution goes only with the natural solutions, that is the afforestation, and rest of the natural solutions. As Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif have emphasized that the world needs to shift the focus on adaptation, that is retaining the global warming on maximum to 2 degrees centigrade. And since the COP-27 was initiated, it was reiterated and it was recommitted that the target of retaining the temperature raise to 1.5 degrees centigrade is still alive. And I think that afforestation is one of the biggest solutions towards that, which is sustainable, which is natural, and which will help in combating this situation more efficiently.
Right, of course, this is going to help us combat the situation as well. Now, let's go to Dr. Niaz Murtaza, who's joined us on Skype as well. Of course, we know that loss and damage has been added to the agenda, apart from the mitigation and adaptation at the COP27 as well. Something very, very significant and also a very big win for Pakistan, who's also the chairperson for the G77 plus China. Do you think this is a diplomatic win for not just Pakistan, but also the global south and developing countries?
Well, yeah, I mean, afforestation, etc., is of course critical to keeping temperatures from shooting more than, the target. But then there is also the reality that, the climate change that has already taken place, and a lot of which is irreversible, has caused huge amount of damage, especially for, developing countries. And especially for large Asian countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, etc. Now these are all countries, especially Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., which don't really contribute much to the processes of global warming. China, of course, is a big emitter itself. It's the number 2 emitter after USA. But then even with China, much of its emissions are driven by manufacturing that feeds consumption in the Western countries. So part of the blame even for Chinese emission goes back to Western countries. But then the reality is that, a lot of things are already starting to happen in those developing countries. And, like we saw with the increased, frequency and intensity of floods that we've seen this year in Pakistan, and there are studies after studies that there is a very strong correlation between climate change and the increase in the intensity and frequency of these kind of floods. So there is a question of, of course, you do need to combat climate change in the future, but then what are you going to do about, the damage that has already taken place in countries which were already living on the edge due to various other reasons, the after effects of colonialism, the very unfair global economic system that you have in terms of, bad trade policies, investment policies, etc. So I think this issue, loss and damage reparations, is a critical issue that needs to be brought up, and it's great that Pakistan is, taking the lead on that and pushing it forcefully. So that, because all the promises that developed countries have made have not been fulfilled yet. So it's very critical that this issue should be, followed up forcefully by all the developing countries together, and to make sure that, the developed countries, which are the biggest, violators, do pay up and help the developing countries recover from the losses.
Right, Dr. Niaz, you've just talked about how there is an imbalance in the countries and after especially the Industrial Revolution. And of course, we know that many people are calling this a climate apartheid as well. It's not just about the fact that the climate change is causing many industrial countries to lower their standard of the carbon emission according to the Paris Agreement, but also of the moral compass. What do you think that the international community can do? And do you think that in the international community would actually pay heed towards giving reparations to the developing countries?
Well, I think a lot of that will get decided tonight, because it's November 8th and it's, the US midterm elections. Of course, the US is critical to any agreement done internationally, and already there was a huge backlash since 2020 after Trump lost. The Biden administration did try to put back climate change on the US domestic agenda. But now, the prediction is that the Republicans are going to make big gains in the Congress, and they are probably going to reverse whatever little steps that the Biden administration has taken. So, the fight is going to become much more difficult, and if in 2 years the Democrats even lose the presidency, then it will become even tougher. So, the work is cut out. There isn't much appetite in the Western countries because of, the recessions that they have themselves faced. There was, COVID-19, and before that there was a 2008 crisis that continued for several years, and now there is, the Ukraine crisis. So, budgets are already stretched in the Western countries. They themselves are facing recession. So it's a huge fight, and it's a long-term fight that has to be fought.
It's a huge fight and a very long-term fight as well, but we are trying to effectively raise our voice, and the UNSG is also highlighting and recognizing how we are trying to fight that fight for not just us but all over the country as well. Dr. Waqar Ahmed, the Joint Executive Director, SDPI, has also joined us. We will talk to him regarding debt swap, debt relief and restructuring as well, but after this short break. Welcome back to Views on News. We have been joined by Dr. Waqar Ahmed, who is the Joint Executive Director for the SDPI. Welcome to PTV World. Of course, we know that there's a lot of talk about debt swap, debt relief and restructuring as well. And a fund has been established by the, of course, rich countries as well to help the developing countries to sustain the debt compensation as well. Do you think this is going to be effective and there will be actual results from this?
Yes, thank you, Tayyaba. Yes, I think this was high time that the developed countries, the rich countries, the global north had moved in this direction. And of course, it is heartening to see that a fund has been established. Of course, more details have to come out, of course, going forward, what will be the modalities of accessing this fund. However, we need to be mindful that for developing countries, accessing any sort of such arrangements is not easy. Even if one looks at the experience of, for example, green bonds, or before that, social bonds, for example, it was never easy because developing countries need to have the necessary conditions to fulfill the due diligence requirements to enter that market, or to at least get the bond arrangements done on those terms which are, of course, feasible to them. So in a sense, unlocking climate finance has been a challenge for countries such as Pakistan. Some part of this has to be done by the global community, but then most of the part has to be done by the recipient countries, including Pakistan. We would need to have institutions which can really prove that, yes, they can be good managers of this kind of funding. They can actually package good investment projects and programs wherein this finance will be directed towards.
Right, that's a very interesting take that you've taken, Dr. Waqar. You've talked about how the burden also comes on the developing states and how they use this as well. You've also talked about how important it is to build our own capacity as well. Let's talk about the capacity building and the technology transfer as well. Do you think that the countries are going to help in the capacity building of the developing countries as well, especially in the wake of the financial and economic crisis that's happening?
Yes, so any part of aid package, even that linked with the climate, does come with a capacity building component. And we have seen this in the past as well. Even apart from climate, all other subjects, including the pandemic and the aid that was associated with pandemic, it did come with capacity building component. The bigger question is that those capacities, once they are built, can they be retained and strengthened? What we have seen over time is that people who are trained handle such kind of aid, or to actually those people who have their terms of reference to unlock such kind of finance, they are usually trained by very specialists in this area, but those people do not remain with these institutions. The turnover of the civil service we have seen has been very frequent. The turnover of the politicians, for example, who were trying to package such transactions, even that has been very frequent, which in a sense also means that the benefits of capacity building over time diminish.
Right, the benefits are diminishing, and that's also almost alarming as well. But of course, let's talk about the interview that took place by Christiane Amanpour with the Foreign Minister Bilal Bhutto Zardari as well, where she talked about a very significant topic, and that is how Notre Dame building, when that was burnt, all the countries, many developed countries rather, they pledged about $100 billion yearly. And Pakistan isn't even getting 10th of the pledge to Pakistan in itself after the flood relief package was announced by the UNSG, and how the flood has created the disaster in Pakistan as well. So do you think that the international community is not taking much heed of the economic crisis that the climate disaster is causing, especially being a transnational issue?
Yes, so I think this is a very important question and observation at the same time. But the fact of the matter is that most of the international development partners have been sympathetic towards Pakistan. But the question which they have posed is very genuine. And that question was that aid which you already have parked in Pakistan, which may be for education, it may be for health, wash, sanitation, any other purpose, that aid is still not being spent properly, which is why, for example, at least two of the leading IFIs have gone ahead and not pledged additional amounts, but rather repurposed whatever was left from the existing ongoing programs. What we need to do is that we need to really demonstrate to the international community that yes, we have the systems, ability, HR to actually absorb in a timely and efficient manner the assistance which will be provided. Till that time, these pledges will be very hard to materialize.
Right. I hope the pledges are not going to be so hard to materialize after some time as well, because of course COP-27, all the heads of the states of the global south are trying to raise effective voices as well, and hopefully this will give us some result. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Waqar Ahmed. Let's go back to Mr. Waqar Sherazi now as well. We've talked about how mitigation, adaptation and loss and damage are very significant aspects of the agenda of the COP27. Do you think the loss and damage, being the first to be included after the G77 plus China meeting, how is it going to impact especially Pakistan?
Tayyaba, the driving force behind the global accelerated action against climate change, to combat the climate change, was and is the finance. And as you have mentioned that in 2015 summit at Paris, the global communities, the countries of the world committed that the rich countries would be paying about $100 billion each year to the countries which receive the adverse effects of climate change, and those are poor countries which are less contributor of carbon emissions. They are not contributor of greenhouse gases. But it was not decided that how this finance will come, who will pay how much amount, and how this finance will be transferred to the countries. So this was an unaddressed issue till now, and by 2022 floods, by 1/3 of Pakistan was submerged. It had to be on the table, and it was rightly mentioned and described by the Prime Minister that this issue has a significance, that it should be discussed on the international forum, and rightfully it has been placed on the agenda. But we'll have to see that how international community put their efforts and fulfill their commitments towards providing the loss and damages, which is again about the finance. And the other thing is also about shifting the private capital, because on estimate it requires $4 trillion a year to combat climate change in next 2 to 3 decades to keep the globe a livable place for all the living beings. So it is not possible without the mega companies that they if they don't shift their capital towards more green solutions and sustainable renewable energy solutions and rest of the things, it will not be possible. So the commitments in Glasgow in 26th summit were made that the private capital would also be shifted from the ways where the climate change has been caused. But I think such commitments are still commitments, and there are no tangible actions observed from the private company owners since there is a lack of political commitment by the head of states as well. So there would be a need of enhanced political commitments by the governments of the countries, so that the private capital also follows towards the transformation towards a renewable energy and towards more green solutions to help positively combat the climate change.
Right, Waqar, Sherazi Sahab, you've talked about the concept of circular economy as well, and the social development being subsiding with the private sector as well. Of course, private sector is very, very significant. Private investments have to be very significant as well. But let's talk about the carbon tax. The private sector and the industrialization and the industrialists are the ones who are creating a lot of carbon footprint in many developed nations as well. In the state of a globalized world where all of the MNCs exist as well, do you think the government and political influence will be able to curtail the impact of the carbon footprint by the private investment sector?
I'm hopeful in this regard, because one of the actions which can be appreciated is the carbon credits. Like in the countries where the plantation has been made, they are eligible to claim the carbon credits internationally. And this factor is supporting the afforestation around the globe. There is a chance for the private entities, for the governments, for the landowners around the globe to grow more trees and to earn carbon credits. To go on a renewable energy that you can earn the carbon credits by placing some of the solar panels at your private entity as well. So I think this is a welcome gesture by the international community, but I do believe that a lot more is required to do by the international community. Many of the mega private entities have come forward, like Microsoft and rest of others, to help combat the climate change, and they are mega contributors of these carbon credits. They are mega buyers of the carbon credits. So I think that I'm not totally unhopeful about the situation.
Should they have a specified amount of carbon credits so that those carbon credits could go to the developing states?
I think that there is a formula which negates the overall generation of the carbon by any particular company or entity, and they have to provide a certain amount with regards to that, but it is not in place at the moment, practically, tangibly. So I think in a year or two, this will also be on the plate.
A lot of talk, a lot of pomp and show, but not many tangible results we're seeing. But we're hopeful that with the COP-27, with the effective voice of the Global South coming up, the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, and not just him, but many other Global South leaders have been coming up and effectively talking about how it's impacting them, because it's a transnational and a global issue, basically. So let's go to Dr. Niaz now. Of course, we know that there is the carbon emission that is basically the core issue of all of this discussion on climate change. Do you think knowledge transfer is very significant? And if it is, how do you think can we transfer this knowledge to create this capability in the developing states to be able to combat it ourselves as well?
Well, of course, developed countries have developed a lot of technologies. Knowledge is, of course, embedded in technologies. Whether you're talking about energy conservation, whether you're talking about water conservation, whether you're talking about, developing crops with, in more marginal environments. There is, of course, a lot of work going on in, universities and institutes in the developed countries. So there is, of course, the need to transfer all that knowledge embedded into technology to the developing countries. But then again, knowledge is one thing. There is also the fact that, there are people who are, much more vulnerable now. And, these huge floods are just one example of the damage that developing countries are facing. And, they are very visible, but on a quieter way, climate change is, wreaking destruction on an every year basis. So, a lot of, soil is getting lost. Very expensive agricultural soil is getting lost because of climate change. Your coastal areas are getting swamped because of rising seas and so on. And those are much quieter than, these huge floods that attract a lot of attention. So there is a need to, have some sort of compensation, and, finance is the critical issue. And
Right.
clearly it's, governments who, rich governments who should be paying, then also, the corporations. There's a list that came out of, how many 75 or 100 corporations that are, putting out the bulk of, the global emissions. So, they
Right.
should be taxed. And then finally, even the consumers who own big cars, big houses, consumption, the finance should come from all these three resources: rich governments, rich consumers, and rich corporations. And there should be a clear mechanism. Countries like Pakistan should not have to go back to the IMF every year now. They should get debt relief linked to, them following good policies on a longer term basis. Investing in, poverty reduction, investing in, industrial processes which reduce climate change, and that should be linked to, debt relief, because those very countries which are the biggest emitters are also the countries to which we owe the biggest debt to. It's either, the USA, the European Union, China, Japan. These are also, you'll see, the countries that have, the biggest debt outstanding to the developing countries. So there should be a write-off of this debt in compensation for the climate destruction that they have caused.
Right. Dr. Murtaza, you've just mentioned certain countries such as China, also India. They're the ones who are also talking about how the carbon emissions that were emitted by the developed countries at that time when industrial revolution was taking place, industrialization was taking place, that has impacted the climate phenomenon of the entire world. And now they're raising the question that now that we are trying to develop our own countries as well through massive industrialization, why is this question being raised, and shouldn't the carbon credits be given to us more? So that is a question that we must, of course, talk about. But do you think that there has to be more circular economy on part of course, mostly the developed states, but also the developing countries such as China and India?
Well, definitely. I mean, especially China, if you look at it, it's a huge emitter on its own rights now. It's the second biggest one after the USA. But then there is also the issue that, the manufacturing of China, which produces these emissions, it gets exported to, the rich countries. It's either Europe, the USA, Japan, and other rich countries, which, import the goods produced by China, which produce the emissions. So
Right.
you have to look at, from that angle, who is consuming the production which is causing the emissions as well. So definitely, it's the richer countries which do the consumption more, not just the production, but the consumption which should pay more.
Right. Now let's go to Mr. Waqar Sherazi. Of course, something very significant, that is the recommendations that I would like to hear from you to how to develop Pakistan's capacity, how to ensure that Pakistan has resilient infrastructure to combat the climate change phenomena, especially the GLOF situation, and so many others.
Well, Tayyaba, there were 4 pillars of the COP-27. The first one was mitigation, how to retain the raise in temperature up to maximum 2 degrees centigrade on average. The second one was adaptation, about creating resilience, providing awareness and enhancing capacity of the poor nations to face the climate changes. The third one was collaboration you mentioned about, that how we reach the tangible agreements and decisions. And the fourth one was finance, which is the driving force behind all these four factors. But as I have mentioned, that there seems to be a little commitment by the international community. They were not ready to include this agenda point of loss and damage into COP27.
Right.
And on recommendation of Pakistan, it was made on the charter of the agenda. So I believe that international community will have to reflect upon. Without the assistance, financial assistance of international community and the technical support of the international community, we in isolation as a developing country cannot isolatedly combat the negative impacts of the climate change, because we are amongst the top 10 countries,
Yes.
but practically the topmost country which is facing the negative impacts of the climate change
Right.
globally. So internationally, international community will have to come forward to join hands with Pakistan. But we also have to reflect upon ourselves. In last 2 decades, the climate change was not an unanticipated phenomena. Everybody knew that there has to be a climate change and there has to be some of the adverse effects. But we did not prepare ourselves. The early warning systems, the river diversion plan, the resilience of communities, the safe places for the communities to be rescued in terms of the catastrophe, during the catastrophe, the disaster risk reduction plan, the disaster response plan, they all were lacking areas. They all were the missing links. And I believe that we are too late. At the moment, we can say that we cannot give a plan and implement that plan in years. It takes times of decades. But at the moment, even if now the international community comes forward and they work with us hand in glove, we will definitely be able to make some remarkable progress in this regard, I think.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us, Waqar Sherazi Saab, expert disaster response, social development and research expert as well. It was a pleasure to have you and listen to your opinion as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go towards a short break and we will be right back with the next topic. Welcome back to Views on News. Of course, a very significant topic, that is the interview to Becky Anderson of CNN by the PTI chairperson Imran Khan, where of course he was talking about the allegations, and Becky Anderson for continuous 12 minutes talked about the evidence. She asked for the evidence on the allegations that were being leveled by the PTI chairperson, and of course that was unfortunate that there were no evidence that were provided as well, because this was an international channel and of course this was a representation of Pakistani politics on the international channel as well. 12 minutes of inability rather to give evidence to Becky Anderson, one of the brilliant journalists as well. And of course, let's go to Dr. Niaz right now. Dr. Niaz, 12 minutes, continuous minutes of the inability to provide evidence, and her consistency in asking the question and requesting him, asking him to give the evidence. What is your take on this?
You know, a bit surprising. If a person has been shot, you would expect whoever is interviewing them that it will be more about sympathy and concern about how the person is, and all that was there as well. She wasn't heartless, but then there was also a certain amount of incredulity throughout the interview about the story that is being spun, and especially the accusations that Mr. Imran Khan is making against three top government functionaries, the civilian side and the security side included. And there was persistent questions on how Mr. Imran Khan could find a link between what happened to him, which was very unfortunate, and I condemn that. Politicians should not be targeted like this, and it's bad politics. But then there is also the question of how the politician behaves after being attacked. If the concern is on keeping national unity, keeping your workers calm so that they don't get overcharged, and trying to be more focused on getting to the bottom of who did it, then it would be a different story. But if the person, the party, from the first minute starts politicizing it and trying to make it an issue to raise the tempo of the long march, because the long march has been going on for a week and it wasn't doing very well. The people were not participating, so immediately within an hour it was converted into an opportunity to somehow whip up emotions for the long march and get more people into it. So I think the international media has caught on that, and there were questions after questions about where is your
Right.
evidence, where is your evidence. And the same question is about, where is the evidence for the cipher, the US conspiracy?
Right, the
So
same
it was a bit
questions are being
embarrassing, I
leveled.
would say, watching it like as a Pakistani, because after all, he is our national leader. So, that's the impression that the international media has.
Right, of course, the allegations have been leveled against the state institutions as well. Do you think there could be an issue on the national security and the national unity of Pakistan because of these allegations?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, this whole thing should have pulled the nation together. And to an extent, the parties in PDM responded very well. There was sympathy, concern from all quarters. The Prime Minister, PPP, Mr. Nawaz Sharif sitting in London, everybody reacted with concern. And this was in sharp contrast to, the attack that had happened on Benazir Bhutto. And you may remember, Mr. Imran Khan had said that she is responsible for what happened to her. But here there was sympathy, and this could have been, built together to, bring some national unity, because there been so much divisive politics. But within an hour, the PTI was down back to its, extremely divisive rhetoric, and just trying to, use it as an opportunity to, make politics more ugly. So it's just
Right.
become, and after that, of course, the other parties also started reacting and made some, mean remarks. But then all in all, that opportunity to bring the nation together has now been lost.
Right, Dr. Niaz, playing with politics and doing the politicization of an issue and bringing up politics at a time when Pakistan, the third of Pakistan, was under flood. There is a lot of relief that has to be done and should have been done. Rehabilitation of the people that is being done by the current federal government as well for the people who suffered. 1,800 people lost their lives. Do you think this was the right time to bring a political rally?
Well, no, of course, that was a big concern. We had this flood towards the end of August, and just even the immediate relief phase lasts for about 3 or 4 months, where people are still homeless, they're living in camps in extreme misery, and then there is the immediate danger of like diseases spreading in the camps. And everybody should have been focused on the aftermath of the flood. And then this is on the back of the economic crisis that we have, which has been going on since December last year. In fact, the whole 3 years of PTI, we saw very huge big inflation. So people had been suffering for at least 3.5 years. And then the economic crisis, and then this flood, and we could just not afford this kind of a political crisis. And we now have a huge political crisis to add a fourth dimension to Pakistan's all crises, economic, flood, political, and then the inflation. So it's just a terrible situation.
Right. Of course, a very, very wrong time to bring in political rallies at a time when people, of course, winters are here as well. There's a lot of climatic shift. We were talking about that earlier as well. They're going to be very extreme for not just the people who have been affected by the floods, but also indirectly impact Pakistan economically and not in so many other ways as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Niaz, Murtaza, political analyst. It was a pleasure talking to you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a time to give your attention to the right news. And the right news is that right now of the people who have been affected by the floods, the people who are still suffering from the floods, the people who are still demanding the repatriation. They're demanding their right, not just, of course, from Pakistan, which the Pakistanis are feeling, and Pakistan being a very charitable nation as well, but also from the international community, because they deserve it and they need more help from Pakistan and more attention. So it is also an appeal to all the media houses to give more attention to those who, of course, need this attention right now to be able to raise their own stance internationally as well. That's all for now. Here we're watching News with Views with Tayyaba Nisar.